Her world was silence and fear. It was a lesson learned in the cradle, a truth whispered in the dark corners of the Omega dens where the forgotten wolves dwelled. To be seen was to be targeted. To be heard was to be punished. So, Lyra learned to be a ghost, a whisper of gray against the stone walls of the obsidian keep. The head servant's voice was a whip crack in the echoing quiet of the kitchens. Head down, eyes lowered, hands steady. Her words lashed at the row of nervous Omegas, each of us dressed in the same drab, scratchy tunics. You are serving the king's royal banquet. You are not guests. You are not wolves. You are shadows meant to serve and nothing more. A dropped tray, a spilled goblet, a single word out of turn, and you will answer to me. Her gaze lingered on Lyra, a cold promise of pain in her eyes. Deep down, Lyra knew the truth. The servant's cruelty was a pale imitation of the court's. Still, a tremor ran through Lyra's hands, and she clasped them together, hiding them in the folds of her tunic. Her fingers brushed against the cool, smooth surface of the locket hidden there. Her mother's locket. A tiny, silver thing shaped like a sleeping wolf, her only possession of any value. It was forbidden, of course. Omegas were not meant to have treasures. Yet she could not part with it. In fact, it was the one thing that reminded her she was more than a shadow. It was a memory of a love she could barely recall, a whisper of a life before this one. As a result, she guarded it fiercely, its secret weight a small rebellion against the crushing weight of her reality. The bitter scent of lemon polish and roasting meat filled the air, a sickening combination of drudgery and a feast she would never taste. The cold of the stone floor seeped through the thin soles of her slippers, a constant reminder of her place. Maybe it was fate that she was chosen for the high table tonight, or maybe it was just bad luck. The doors to the grand hall were thrown open, and the sound of the court, a wave of laughter, clinking glasses, and arrogant voices crashed over them. Her heart hammered, a drum against her ribs, too loud. Surely they could all hear it. Just be invisible, she prayed to the moon goddess she wasn't even sure listened to Omegas. Let me be nothing at all. But then, she was handed a heavy silver pitcher of wine, its surface so polished she could see her own terrified, wide-eyed reflection. And she was nudged forward, into the light, into the den of predators.
Meanwhile, on the dais, King Aldrich felt the familiar weight of the crown, a cold, heavy circle of gold that was more a prison than a privilege. The grand hall was a kaleidoscope of nauseating color and sound. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and roasted boar, felt cloying, suffocating. He hated these banquets. He hated the false smiles, the simpering nobles, the endless, draining charade of it all. He projected an aura of cold, bored indifference because history had taught him a bloody lesson. A king's kindness was an invitation for a knife in the back. His father had been kind. He'd been loved. And he'd been betrayed and slaughtered in his own throne room, his blood staining the very stones Aldrich now ruled from. So, Aldrich had rebuilt the kingdom on a foundation of something stronger than love. Fear. To be strong, to be unfeeling, to be absolute. That was survival. That's why he sat like a statue of ice and granite, his golden eyes sweeping over the hall with a gaze that missed nothing and revealed nothing. The reports from the Shadowfen border are concerning, my king. Lord Valerius murmured beside him, his voice a smooth, oily whisper. Valerius was the head of his council, a wolf whose ambition was as sharp and dangerous as his teeth. The feral packs grow bold. They will be put down, Aldrich replied, his voice a low rumble that cut through the nearby chatter. His focus was on the maps in his mind, on the logistics of moving warriors, not on the feast before him. More importantly, he knew Valerius was not truly concerned with the border. The old wolf was circling a different topic. A show of strength is needed, Valerius continued, his eyes glinting. An alliance. My daughter, Elena, returns from her training with the Silver Crest Pack next month. A union between our houses would solidify the kingdom, my king. It would quell any Rumors of instability. Instability. Valerius meant Aldrich's lack of a queen, of an heir. A king without a mate was a king whose future was uncertain, which meant he was vulnerable. Before Aldrich could deliver a cutting reply, the servants began to move through the hall. He watched them with detached disinterest. They were cogs in the machine, necessary but insignificant. Gray-clad shadows moving between the vibrant colors of the nobility. Moments later, one of them approached the high table. A flicker of gray, and nothing more. He dismissed her from his thoughts before her image could even fully form, turning his attention back to the veiled threats of his council head. The girl, the wine, the banquet, it was all just noise. The only thing that mattered was the crown, and the cold, lonely vigilance required to keep it.
As the hall filled with the boisterous energy of the Pax Elite, her world shrank to the few feet of polished floor in front of her. Her goal was agonizingly simple: reach the table, pour the wine, and retreat. Don't tremble, don't spill, don't look up. Especially don't look at him. But she couldn't help it. As she drew near the dais, her eyes darted up for a single terrifying second. King Aldrich. He wasn't a man, but a mountain carved from storm clouds and shadow, his presence a crushing weight in the room. His hair was the black of a starless night, and his eyes. Even from here, she could feel their intensity. Golden, like a wolf's. Predatory. He wasn't laughing or drinking like the others. Instead, he sat with a chilling stillness, listening to the silver-haired lord at his side, his expression a mask of cold command. Her breath caught. That was power. Absolute and terrifying. In that moment, she understood why the world trembled before him. He was a king who did not ask for loyalty, but commanded it through sheer, unrelenting force. She reached the table of elite warriors just below the dais. They were the king's personal guard, alphas of the highest rank, their laughter loud and cruel. Her hands began to shake, and the wine sloshed precariously in the pitcher. To make things worse, one of them, a brute with a scarred face she recognized as Gavril, turned his attention to the Omegas. His eyes were full of a bored, malicious hunger. Without warning, a foot shot out. A young Omega girl beside Lyra cried out, stumbling over it. A splash of crimson wine stained the pristine white tablecloth. Silence fell around their table. A guard stormed over, grabbing the girl by the arm. "Clumsy wretch," he snarled, dragging her away. Gavril and his friends roared with laughter, the sound sharp and ugly. They had done it on purpose, of course they had. Because of that, a fresh wave of terror washed over Lyra. This was their sport, their entertainment, and she was next.
From there, the king's displeasure was a subtle thing, a slight tightening of his jaw, a narrowing of his golden eyes. He saw the commotion, the spilled wine, the cowering Omega, the boisterous laughter from his warriors. It was an unwelcome disruption, an imperfection in the orderly running of his court. Truth be told, he felt no pity for the girl. He felt only irritation, weakness, clumsiness. These things disgusted him. They were flaws in the system, and he had no tolerance for flaws. Gavril's behavior was equally irritating, undisciplined, boorish. An alpha should have more control. He made a mental note to have Gavril assigned to a month of latrine duty. It was a petty punishment for a petty crime, beneath his direct attention but necessary to maintain order. He did nothing more. To intervene personally would be to acknowledge the Omega's existence as anything other than a clumsy servant. And she was not. No matter how hard she tried to be invisible, the universe had other plans. The king's gaze swept past the scene, but not before he saw Gavril turn. The warrior's eyes, filled with arrogance and cheap cruelty, landed on the other Omega servant, the one with the pitcher, the shadow he had dismissed moments before. He saw the warrior's lips curl into a malicious grin, for a reason he could not fathom, an anomaly, a flicker in the cold calculus of his mind. His gaze lingered for a single extra heartbeat on the girl. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she flinched, the desperate prayer for invisibility in her posture. Then he looked away, dismissing it. It was not his concern. The weak were always prey for the strong. That was the law of the world, a law he had built his kingdom upon. He turned back to Valerius, ready to put an end to the conversation about marriage, when Gavril stood up. He watched the warrior swagger toward the terrified girl, his movements a predator's slow, deliberate stalk. His grin was a promise of pain, and he was walking toward her.
Gavril was in front of her. The world narrowed to the scarred, leering face of the warrior and the heavy, ornate goblet in his hand. Her blood turned to ice. Her feet were roots, tangled in the cold stone floor. She tried to move, to step back, to become the shadow she was trained to be. But she couldn't. Maybe it was fate that held her there, a cruel and unblinking eye. He said something. A joke, maybe. A taunt. The words were lost in the blood roaring in her ears. Laughter erupted from his companions, a harsh, ugly sound that felt like stones being thrown against her skin. Without warning, he tilted his hand. In that moment, time seemed to stretch, to pull like taffy. She saw the dark red liquid crest the silver lip of the goblet. She saw the cruel delight in his eyes. She saw her own reflection, small and broken, in the polished curve of the metal. And then the wine, cold, sticky, red, streamed down her face. It plastered her hair to her scalp, dripped into her eyes, and ran in rivulets down her cheeks like bloody tears. The sweet, cloying scent of it filled her nose, a smell she would now forever associate with utter, soul-crushing shame. The laughter around her exploded. It was a physical force, a wall of sound that slammed into her, seeking to crush what little was left of her spirit. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single silent prayer dying on her lips. Let the ground swallow me. Let me cease to be. Deep down, she knew the truth. This was her value. She was a thing to be used for sport, a joke, nothing. But then, a sound ripped through the hall. It wasn't human, it was a growl, a low, guttural, earth-shaking rumble that vibrated through the stone floor and up her bones. It was a sound of pure, unrestrained fury, a sound of a predator about to kill. The laughter died instantly. A blanket of absolute, terrified silence fell over the grand hall. Her eyes fluttered open. Every single head in the room, every noble, every warrior, every servant was staring at the high table, at the king. Aldrich was on his feet, or halfway there, his body coiled like a great beast about to spring. His chair was overturned behind him. His hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table, and his face was a mask of such feral rage that it stole the breath from her lungs. His golden eyes were fixed on Gavril, and they were glowing.
The scent hit him first. It wasn't the wine. It was something sharper, cleaner. A scent like ozone after a lightning strike. It sliced through the thick, cloying atmosphere of the banquet hall and went straight to the ancient, primal core of him. Distress. And not just any distress. His head snapped up. His eyes found her, the gray shadow, just as the wine began to pour, and as he saw the red stain her hair, as he smelled her sharp, piercing humiliation, something inside him broke. The king, the cold, calculating ruler, vanished. In his place was the wolf, and the wolf saw its mate being harmed. A rage unlike anything he had ever known, not even in the blood-soaked battle to retake his throne, erupted in his chest. It was a white-hot, possessive fury that demanded blood. It was an instinct so powerful, so absolute, that it bypassed every wall he had ever built, every ounce of control he had ever cultivated. Before he could move, the growl ripped itself from his throat, a promise of death that silenced a room of killers. In the span of a breath, the world came roaring back. The silence, the fear, the hundreds of eyes staring, not at Gavril, but at him. He saw the shock on Valerius's face, the terror on the nobles. He had just committed the one sin a king like him could never afford. He had shown emotion. He had shown a weakness. And he had shown it for an Omega. His mind raced, the king wrestling back control from the snarling wolf. Damage control. Now. He couldn't go to her. He couldn't rip Gavril's throat out with his bare teeth as every fiber of his being screamed at him to do. He had to play the part. He straightened slowly, his movements lethally calm. His eyes, however, remained locked on the stunned, wine-soaked warrior. Gavril's face had gone pale, the arrogant smirk wiped away, replaced by dawning terror. Without another word, Aldrich lifted his hand and gave a subtle, sharp flick of his fingers. It was all the command that was needed. Moments later, two of his royal guard, their faces grim, materialized at Gavril's side. They seized the warrior by the arms, their grips like iron. There was no struggle. There was no protest. To defy the king in this state was suicide. As they dragged the terrified warrior from the hall, Aldrich finally allowed his gaze to shift. He looked at her, the girl, the Omega, his mate. She was still frozen, drenched and trembling, her eyes wide with a terror that was now aimed squarely at him. She was a mess. She was insignificant. She was the most magnificent creature he had ever seen. The wolf inside him wanted to soothe her. The king knew he had to ignore her. That's why he gave a curt, dismissive nod to the head servant, an unspoken order to get the girl out of his sight. It was the cruelest, kindest thing he could do. Cruel to her because it looked like cold dismissal. Kind to them both because if she stayed in his presence a moment longer, he didn't know if he could stop himself from going to her, and that would be the end of them all.
She ran. The moment the head servant hissed, "Get out!" Her legs finally obeyed. Her body moved on instinct, carrying her through the stunned crowd, away from the hundreds of staring eyes, away from the terrifying, glowing gaze of the king. She didn't know where she was going. She just fled, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone corridors, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. She didn't stop until she found herself in the one place she knew no one of importance would ever go. The Moonthorn Garden. It was a wild, overgrown place at the back of the keep, forgotten by the gardeners. Thorns choked the rose bushes, and moonlight spilled through the tangled branches, painting the weeds in strokes of silver and shadow. At its center was a small stone fountain, its water black and still. Without thinking, she fell to her knees beside it and plunged her hands into the icy water. She began to scrub at her hair, at her face, her movements frantic, desperate. She had to get the smell off, the sticky, shameful scent of wine and humiliation. Tears finally came, hot and silent, mixing with the cold water on her skin. What had she done? What had happened? The king? He had looked at her. He had growled for her. She didn't know what scared her more, the warrior's cruelty or the king's terrifying, inexplicable fury. A twig snapped behind her. Her head shot up, her heart leaping into her throat. She spun around, expecting a guard, expecting the head servant, expecting a punishment she couldn't even begin to imagine. But it was him. King Aldrich stood at the edge of the clearing, a towering silhouette against the moon. He was alone. His crown was gone, his formal tunic unclasped at the throat. He wasn't the king on the dais anymore. He was something older, wilder. He was a predator, and she was his prey. The space between them burned with a tension so thick it felt like she was breathing water. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to hide, to grovel. She scrambled backwards, away from the fountain, her hands scraping against the rough stone. "Please," her voice trembled, a pathetic whisper. "Please, Your Majesty, I did nothing. I swear." He didn't move. He just watched her, his golden eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed to see right through her skin, right into the frantic, terrified beating of her heart. As the silence stretched, he took one slow, deliberate step forward, and then another. He moved with a lethal grace she had never seen, the silence of a wolf stalking through the forest. He didn't stop until he was standing over her, close enough that she had to crane her neck back to see his face, a face carved from moonlight and hard angles. Her world tilted. He smelled of pine and cold night air, and something else. Something that made her own wolf, the timid, sleeping creature deep inside her, stir for the first time in her life. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. When her name left his lips, it wasn't a king's command or a judge's sentence. It was a rough, aching whisper that hung in the cold night air, a sound both terrifying and impossibly gentle. Lyra. The king's voice saying her name, it shattered the last of her composure. She was a thing of the court, a ghost in the halls, and he had given her a name. Before she could move, he knelt. The alpha king of all wolves, the ruthless, the cold, the terrible, knelt in the dirt and weeds of a forgotten garden, bringing his piercing golden eyes level with hers. The universe tilted on its axis. The air thickened, charged with a power that made the tiny wolf inside her want to curl at his feet. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, and his voice was a low, rough thing, like stones grinding together. It was not gentle, but it was not cruel either. It was something else entirely, something that made her skin prickle with a strange, unfamiliar heat. Her breath caught. Then, "What do you want?" she whispered, the words barely audible. As the silence stretched, his gaze dropped to her tunic, still damp and stained, then to the locket that had fallen from beneath the collar, resting against her chest. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. With a single glance, he seemed to strip away every layer of her fear, leaving her feeling raw and exposed beneath the moonlight. "I want to know who you are," he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried the weight of a command that could not be defied. Before the words left her lips, she was gone. Not by his order, but by the sudden appearance of a grim-faced servant who materialized from the shadows, bowing low. "Your Majesty." The spell was broken. The king was a king once more. He stood, his face becoming a mask of cold indifference. He gave a curt nod, a dismissal. For her. The journey back was a blur through secret, winding passages she never knew existed. The servant was silent, a phantom leading a ghost. By the time the hidden door to the Omega dens creaked open, Lyra's heart was a wild, frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She half expected the head servant to be waiting, rod in hand. She expected punishment, banishment, death. Instead, there was nothing. Just the familiar scent of lye soap and sleeping bodies. Which meant one thing. The king had commanded their silence. She collapsed onto her thin straw mattress, her body trembling not from cold, but from the aftershock of his presence. His scent still clung to her clothes. His voice still echoed in her ears. Her world had been small and gray and safe in its misery. And now it was vast and terrifying and lit by the impossible glow of a king's golden eyes.
Come morning, the king sat upon his throne of black obsidian, a scroll of trade negotiations open and unread in his lap. The events of the previous night were a feral storm raging behind the calm facade of his face. Lyra. Her name hung in the air of his mind. Her scent, that impossible, intoxicating scent of moonlight and fear and something deeply, truly hers, was a ghost in the back of his throat. The wolf was pacing, restless and demanding, at the edge of his consciousness. It wanted to go to her, to find her, to claim her. It was madness. He was a king. She was an Omega. The law was the law, his own law. Despite that, he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he would sooner burn his kingdom to the ground than let anyone harm her again. A royal herald announced the arrival of Lord Valerius. Aldrich steeled himself, the king shoving the wolf back into its cage. Valerius entered the throne room alone, his steps silent, his face a mask of polite concern, but his eyes, The pale, cunning eyes of an old wolf were sharp with suspicion. "Your Majesty," Valerius began, his voice smooth as polished stone, "I come to express the concern of the court. Your display last night was powerful, but your judgment against warrior Gavril, a high-born alpha, for a trifle involving a mere servant, has been noted." Aldrich's fingers tightened on the scroll. "Gavril is a warrior of my royal guard. His discipline reflects upon me. He was undisciplined." "Of course, my king," Valerius said, the words a placating balm that didn't quite cover the poison beneath. "Yet, perception is a fragile thing. The pack must see its alpha as unshakable. To be moved to such public anger by the plight of an Omega, it could be perceived by lesser wolves as a sign of sentiment." There it was, the veiled threat, the first move in a game Aldrich knew Valerius was born to play. "My actions require no explanation," Aldrich said, his voice dropping, a low warning rumble. "Gavril will spend a month in the kennels, and you will remind the court that any wolf who disrupts the order of my hall answers to me. Is that clear?" Valerius bowed his head, a gesture of submission that was anything but. "Perfectly, my king. I live only to serve the stability of your throne." The old wolf paused as if an afterthought. "It is only for that reason that I am so pleased to announce my daughter Elena's return. A strong alpha queen at your side will silence any and all whispers. It will be a glorious day for the kingdom." He was a snake, and he had just shown his fangs.
Meanwhile, in the gray, suffocating world of the Omega dens, Lyra learned that the king's attention was a curse as much as a shield. Her silence had been bought, but the price was isolation. The other Omegas, who had once shared their meager crusts of bread and whispered fears with her, now fell silent when she approached. Their eyes held a new expression when they looked at her, a bitter, resentful curiosity. To make things worse, their whispers followed her like shadows. "The king's pet," a young wolf named Alara muttered, just loud enough for Lyra to hear. "Did you see how he looked at her?" "She must be a witch," another whispered, to ensnare the Alpha King himself. Their fear had curdled into jealousy. She was no longer one of them. She was something other, something dangerous. She tried to explain, to tell them she was just as terrified as they were, but her words fell into a well of hostile silence. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, adrift in a sea of suspicion. That night, as she lay on her mattress, her stomach aching with a hunger that was more loneliness than lack of food, a different servant appeared. Not the grim-faced one from the night before, but a matronly woman whose face was kind. Without a word, the woman placed a small covered tray beside Lyra's bed, and then vanished as silently as she had come. As if summoned by the impossible scent, Lyra sat up. Her heart pounded. She lifted the cloth. Her breath hitched. It was a feast. A small one, but a feast nonetheless. A thick slice of warm, crusty bread, a wedge of soft white cheese, a cluster of purple grapes glistening with dew, an apple so red it looked like a jewel. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and she knew, with every fiber of her being, who had sent it. In the quiet that followed, a war raged inside her. He was the king, a killer, a man of ice and fury, and he had sent her this small, secret, impossible kindness. With trembling fingers, she broke off a piece of the bread. She could devour it all, hoard it for herself. She deserved it, didn't she? After a lifetime of scraps. But then, she looked across the dark room, at the sleeping forms of the other Omegas. She saw Alara's thin shoulders, heard the quiet whimper of a younger girl who cried in her sleep every night. Her instincts surged. She stood up, the tray in her hands. She walked to Alara's bedside and placed a piece of cheese on the girl's threadbare blanket. She moved to the next bed, leaving a cluster of grapes, and the next, until the tray was empty, save for the single red apple. She returned to her mattress and took a bite. The sweetness exploded on her tongue, a taste of a world she had never known. When she looked up, she saw Lyra and 2 other Omegas awake now, staring at her. Their faces were no longer hard with suspicion. In the dim light, she saw only a confused, weary gratitude. Maybe she wasn't so alone after all. But as she lay down to sleep, the apple's sweet taste still on her lips, she couldn't escape the truth. This gift, this act of secret care, had just drawn a line in the sand. It bound her to the terrifying king in a way that was deeper and more dangerous than any public display of fury. He had claimed her in the garden with his eyes. Now he was claiming her with his protection. And she was caught, a lone wolf trapped between the cold distrust of her pack and the burning, possessive attention of the Alpha King. The secret summons came more frequently after that. Sometimes a week would pass, a long, agonizing stretch of silence where Lyra would begin to believe it was all a dream, a fever fantasy born of humiliation and fear. Then, the quiet, matronly servant would appear at her bedside in the dead of night, a single silent finger pressed to her lips, and lead her away into the shadows of the keep. Their sanctuary was always the same, the Moonthorn Garden. Her fear of the king had not vanished, not entirely. Instead, it had changed. It was no longer the terror of a mouse before a lion. It was the breathtaking, heart-stopping fear of standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind pulling at you, a wild and thrilling call to jump. He was a creature of silence and shadows, more wolf than man in this wild, overgrown place. He rarely spoke of the court, of his laws, or of the crown that weighed so heavily on his brow. In fact, he rarely spoke much at all. But he watched her. His golden eyes would follow her as she explored the garden, tracing the path of a moth in the moonlight, or touching the soft petals of a sleeping flower. And in those long, stretched silences, she began to see the things no one else in the kingdom could. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the profound loneliness in his gaze, the constant, simmering vigilance of a wolf who had never known a moment's peace. Tonight, she found him standing by a cluster of strange, pale flowers she had never noticed before. They were closed tight, like tiny, white fists. "What are they?" she asked, her voice a soft thing in the quiet of the night. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the blooms. "Nocturne blooms," he rumbled. "They are cowards. They only open in the deepest dark when they believe no one is watching." As if pulled by a string, her body moved closer until she stood beside him. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell that scent of pine and cold night air that made her head spin. "Why?" she whispered. He finally turned his head, his eyes catching the moonlight. "Because they are more resilient than they look. Their petals are too delicate for the sun. But in the dark, they can survive the harshest frost, the cruelest winds. They have a strength that is made for the shadows." The moment their eyes locked, something shifted. He wasn't talking about the flowers anymore. He was talking about her. Her heart skipped. He saw her. Not as a servant, not as an Omega, but as something that could survive. Something strong in its own quiet, shadowed way. In the stillness that followed, she felt a sudden, reckless bravery. "And you, Your Majesty? Are you a nocturne bloom? Do you only open in the dark?" A muscle in his jaw clenched. His gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch, a brand against her skin. The air thickened, the space between them crackling with an energy she didn't understand, but felt in the marrow of her bones. He opened his mouth to speak. Snap. The sound of a breaking twig from the path just beyond the garden wall shattered the night.
Instinct. Pure, unthinking, predatory instinct. Between one breath and the next, he had Lyra by the arm, pulling her back, spinning her behind the thick stone trellis that was choked with ancient ivy. He pressed her into the cold stone, his own body a shield in front of hers, one hand clamped gently but firmly over her mouth. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, killing fury. Someone was here. He held his breath, listening. The forest held its breath with him. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and a voice that made the wolf in his blood snarl, "Lord Valerius." "A shame the gardeners have let this place go to ruin," the old wolf said, his voice carrying easily in the still night air. He was speaking to his personal guard, a hulking alpha named Titus. "It speaks of a lack of discipline, of order. When the wild is allowed to creep in at the edges, it can poison the heart of the keep itself." Aldrich could feel Lyra trembling against him. Her fear was a sharp, sweet scent in the air, and it took every ounce of his control not to let out a warning growl. He pressed himself closer, trying to shield her scent with his own, his hand still firm over her mouth. "Instability is a rot, Titus," Valerius continued, his footsteps stopping just on the other side of the trellis, mere feet away. "It starts with small things, a lapse in judgment, an unsuitable attachment. A king must be a rock, an unfeeling, unmoving mountain. The moment he allows sentiment to cloud his vision, he invites the jackals to his throat." The words were a direct poisoned arrow aimed at Aldrich's heart. He knew. Valerius didn't have proof, but he knew. The old wolf was hunting, and he was closing in. Lyra's muffled gasp was a tiny, desperate sound against his palm. He could feel the frantic beat of her pulse against his fingertips. And in that moment, pressed together in the suffocating dark, a terrible truth became clear. This was no longer just his secret. It was their shared danger. The game had changed. This wasn't just about a forbidden, impossible bond anymore. This was about his throne and her life. He waited, every muscle coiled, ready to fight, to kill, to do whatever was necessary to protect the trembling woman in his arms. The silence stretched for an eternity. Eventually, Valerius spoke again, his voice moving away. "Come. The hour grows late, and our king will need all his strength for the days to come." The footsteps faded, but the threat remained, a cold poison hanging in the garden air.
He didn't let her go. Not right away. For a long, breathless moment after Valerius's footsteps disappeared, they remained pressed together in the dark. She could feel the violent thrum of his heart against her back, a wild and furious rhythm that echoed her own. His hand was still over her mouth, but the pressure had softened, his thumb now stroking gently against her cheek. When he finally stepped back, the absence of his heat was a sudden, shocking cold. He didn't look at her. Instead, he stared at the path where Valerius had been, his jaw set like granite. Without another word, he turned and led her away, not towards the Omega dens, but deeper into the keep, through a maze of corridors she had never seen before. They ended at a heavy iron-banded door. He pushed it open, revealing not a garden, but his own private chambers. It was a cage of a room. Maps covered the walls, held down by daggers. A massive desk was littered with scrolls and reports. A rack of swords and axes stood gleaming and deadly in the corner. It was the room of a warrior and a king, a room that smelled of leather, steel, and his chilling authority. He walked to the fireplace, his back to her. "This was a mistake," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all the rough warmth it had held in the garden. It was the king's voice, cold, final. Her chest ached. "It ends," he continued, still not looking at her. "Now, you will not be summoned again. You will keep your head down, you will do your duties, and you will stay away from me. It is the only way to keep you safe." The old Lyra, the girl from a few weeks ago, would have whispered, "Yes, Your Majesty." She would have bowed her head and accepted her fate, grateful to have survived. But something inside her shifted. She thought of the nocturne bloom, the flower that was strong in the shadows. She thought of the terror she felt hiding behind the trellis and the strange, fierce safety of being held against his chest. And she realized she didn't want to be safe if it meant being invisible again. "No." The word was a quiet breath, but in the roaring silence of the room, it felt like a thunderclap. Aldrich froze. He turned his head slowly, his golden eyes wide with a stunned, dangerous disbelief. "What did you say?" She took a breath, her own courage shocking her. "I said no," she repeated, her voice clearer this time. "I am not afraid of him. I have been afraid my whole life, Your Majesty. Afraid of being noticed, afraid of being punished, afraid of being... nothing. Hiding in the dark with you. That did not feel like fear. It felt like, for the first time, I wasn't alone in it." The tension broke. He crossed the room in 2 long, silent strides. He was a storm, a force of nature, and he stopped just before her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He stared down at her, his face a conflict of rage, disbelief, and something else. Something that looked dangerously like wonder. "You do not know what you are saying," he growled, his voice low and laced with a desperate warning. "You are an Omega. He will crush you like an insect to get to me." "Let him try," she whispered, her gaze locked with his. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The king, the wolf, the man. They all warred in his eyes. He had tried to push her away, to put her back in her cage to keep her safe. But she had refused to be caged, and he let it happen. The last of his control shattered. A raw sound, half groan, half growl, tore from his chest. His hands came up, not to push her away, but to cup her face, his touch both rough and reverent. "You have no idea what you do to me," he rasped. And then his mouth was on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, hungry claiming. It was the breaking of a dam, the unleashing of every forbidden instinct he had kept chained in the dark. It was the taste of pine and power, of loneliness and longing, a kiss that sealed their fate in a searing, undeniable fire. Her world tilted, her hands coming up to grip his arms as the floor seemed to fall away beneath her. This was not a mistake. This was the beginning of the war. That kiss was not an end. It was a declaration. It was the lighting of a fuse in a castle made of gunpowder. He had walked away from her that night, his lips still burning, the scent of her on his skin, and a cold, terrible clarity in his mind. The game of shadows was over. Valerius had hunted them in the dark, and now Aldrich would bring the war into the light. He didn't have to wait long. The next evening, the grand hall was once again filled to bursting. But this was different. The air was not festive, it was tense, expectant. Because of that, every wolf in the kingdom knew why they were here. To welcome Lady Elena, Valerius's daughter. Aldrich watched her enter from his throne, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He had to admit, she was a perfect specimen, tall, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes like chips of ice. She moved with the predatory grace of a high-born alpha female, a queen in all but name. She was everything his court expected, everything his father would have advised. She was a beautiful, gilded cage. Valerius beamed beside her, a proud father and a master manipulator all in one. He led his daughter before the throne, the entire court watching, holding their collective breath. "My king," Valerius began, his voice booming with false sincerity. "I present my daughter, Lady Elena of the Silver Crest, a true alpha, fit to stand beside the mightiest of rulers." He then turned to the assembled nobles. "Our kingdom has been without a queen for too long. An alpha king needs an alpha queen. I say we celebrate a union that will secure our future for 1,000 years." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. It was a perfectly executed political ambush. To refuse now would be to insult not just Valerius and his powerful house, but all of them. It would be an act of instability, an act of a king whose judgment was compromised. From there, Valerius turned back to him, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. "What say you, my king?" Aldrich let the silence stretch. He let them all wait. His gaze drifted over Valerius's head across the sea of expectant faces and found her, Lyra. She was standing near the back wall, holding a silver tray, pretending to be invisible. But he saw her. In a room full of vibrant color and loud noise, She was the only thing that felt real. Her eyes were wide, full of a terrifying, fragile hope. She was waiting to see if the man from the garden was real, or if the king would devour him. In that moment, he made his choice. He stood, the scraping of his throne a harsh sound in the sudden quiet. His voice, when it came, was not a shout. It was a low, cold, lethal thing that cut through the hall like a blade of ice. "I say," Aldrich began, his golden eyes locked on Lyra's, a silent promise passing between them, "that the future of this kingdom is mine to decide." He then looked directly at a stunned Valerius. "And I have already made my choice. Your proposal is rejected." Her breath caught in her throat. The silver tray in her hands trembled, threatening to fall. He had done it. In front of the entire world, he had chosen her. He hadn't said her name, he hadn't looked at her for more than a second, but every wolf in that room felt the truth of it. The king had refused a perfect alpha queen for a reason, and that reason was standing in the shadows, dressed in the rags of an omega. A wave of dizziness washed over her. It was a feeling of pure, terrifying triumph. But then she saw Lord Valerius's face. The old wolf's polite mask had vanished. For a single, chilling instant, she saw the true predator beneath. His eyes, fixed on her from across the hall, were not angry. They were cold, calculating. It was a look that promised not a swift death, but a slow, agonizing destruction. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she had just been marked for death. The feast ended in a haze of tense whispers. Lyra was dismissed, and she fled back to the Omega dens, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was no longer just Lyra. She was the king's weakness, the chink in his armor, and Valerius would now dedicate all his cunning to destroying her. She reached the relative safety of the dens, her hands still shaking. The other Omegas watched her enter, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. She was no longer just an outcast. She was the epicenter of a storm that could destroy them all. "Guards!" The shout came from the corridor. The heavy door to the dens was thrown open, slamming against the stone wall. 2 royal guards filled the doorway, their faces grim. Behind them stood the head servant, her expression pinched with malicious glee. "Search the den," the guard commanded. "We have it on good authority that a traitor hides among you." Panic erupted. The Omegas cried out, scrambling back as the guards began to tear through their meager belongings, overturning mattresses, kicking aside small wooden boxes. Lyra stood frozen, her blood turning to ice. Traitor? A beat later, a guard stopped at her mattress. He knelt, his hand reaching beneath it. When he stood up, he was holding a small, dark glass vial, sealed with wax. "What is this?" he snarled, holding it up for all to see. Her thoughts spun. She had never seen it before in her life. It's not mine," she stammered, her voice trembling. The head servant stepped forward, a cruel smile on her face. "That is the Omega Lyra, the one who has so captured the king's attention." The guard's eyes narrowed on her. He broke the wax seal with his thumb and sniffed the contents. His face went pale. "Nightshade," he breathed, his voice a horrified whisper. Concentrated and laced with silver dust. As if the world narrowed, she heard gasps all around her. Everyone knew what that meant. It was a poison designed for one purpose, and one purpose only: to kill a royal alpha. It was the same poison that had been used to murder the old king. Before she could scream, before she could plead, the guards seized her. Rough hands grabbed her arms, twisting them behind her back. Cold iron shackles were snapped onto her wrists. As they dragged her from the den, her eyes locked with Alara's. The other girl's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Because of that, Lyra knew. This was not a mistake. This was a message. And she was the one who was about to be silenced.
He was in the throne room staring into the fire when the news came. The word treason was a hiss of poison in the air. The word omega was a hammer blow to his heart. And the phrase nightshade and silver was a ghost from his past, rising up to choke him. He arrived at the dungeons just as they were shoving her into a cold, damp cell. She was shackled, her face pale with shock, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror. The moment their eyes locked, the wolf inside him roared, a caged, helpless beast of pure fury. He wanted to kill them all, every guard who had touched her, every servant who had accused her. He wanted to tear the bars of the cell from the stone with his bare hands and carry her away. But he was the king, and his own laws were the bars of his cage. "Leave us," he growled at the guards. His voice was so low, so filled with menace, that they scrambled away without a second thought. As the echo of their footsteps faded, he was alone with her, a set of iron bars between them. She looked so small, so fragile. "It wasn't me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Aldrich, I swear it." "I know," he said, his own voice rough with an agony he could not show. He gripped the cold iron bars, the metal groaning under the pressure. He knew. Of course he knew. This was Valerius's masterstroke, a move of such cruel, brilliant simplicity. He had used Aldrich's own history, the ghost of his murdered father, as a weapon. Truth be told, there was no defense. She was an omega. She had been seen to have the king's favor. Now the means to kill him was found in her bed. No one would believe her innocent. To defend her would be to declare himself a fool, or worse, a co-conspirator. The heavy footsteps approaching from behind were expected. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. "A terrible business, my king," Lord Valerius said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "To think, a viper so close to the heart of the kingdom. The court is in an uproar. They demand justice." Aldrich turned slowly, his face a mask of cold, deadly calm. "And what justice do they demand, Valerius?" The old wolf's eyes glinted with triumph. He had won. He knew he had won. "The law is clear," Valerius said, his voice dropping. "Treason against the crown is punishable by death, a public execution. It is the only way to show the pack that their king is strong, decisive, and will not tolerate threats, no matter how personally appealing they may be." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a noose. "Execute the Omega at dawn," Valerius continued, his voice now a hard, cold whisper. "Show them you are a true Alpha King. Then, announce your betrothal to my daughter. Unite the packs, secure your reign, and this unfortunate distraction will be forgotten." He took a step closer, his final threat delivered with the precision of a killing blow. "Or, don't. Defend her. Let the court see you choose an Omega traitor over the stability of your kingdom, and I will personally show them all how a weak, compromised king can be replaced." The ultimatum was delivered. His choice was simple: her life, or his crown. He looked back at Lyra, at the single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek, and he knew he could not have both. That night the crown was not a symbol of power. It was a millstone dragging him into the abyss. He did not sleep. Instead, he sat on the cold, unforgiving obsidian of his throne, the great hall empty save for the flickering torches that cast long, dancing shadows. The ghosts of his past were his only company. He saw his father, his kind face smiling, his hand resting on Aldrich's shoulder. "A king's strength is in his heart, my son." And then he saw his father's body, sprawled on this very floor, his heart's blood staining the stones a deep, dark crimson. He had built his entire life, his entire reign, on the ashes of that memory. He had sworn a vow in blood and fire that he would never be his father. He would be cold where his father was warm. He would be a fist where his father was an open hand. He would be strong. And yet, what had that strength bought him? He stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his golden eyes. He had played every scenario, moved every piece on the political board in his mind. But Valerius had built a perfect trap. To save Lyra was to declare himself weak, sentimental, a fool ruled by an Omega. The nobles, hungry for the power Valerius promised, would see it as a signal. The kingdom would bleed. To sacrifice her was to obey his own law. It was the strong, decisive, kingly thing to do. It would secure his throne, solidify his power, and prove to everyone that he was the unfeeling monster he pretended to be. It would also be the end of him. To make things worse, the wolf inside him was a caged, frantic thing, clawing at the bars of his control. It did not understand politics, it did not understand crowns or laws, it understood only one primal, undeniable truth. Mate is in danger. Protect, save, kill for her. He was a king trapped between his past and his future, between his vow and his soul. For the first time since he was a boy watching his father die, Aldrich of the Obsidian Throne felt utterly, hopelessly powerless. The first rays of dawn painted the high windows of the hall in shades of gray and blood. A guard entered, his footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. He knelt. "Your Majesty," the guard said, his voice low. "The courtyard is ready." The time for choices was over.
Meanwhile, in the dungeon, a strange and terrible peace had settled over Lyra. The fear was gone. The anger was gone. In their place was a hollow, empty calm. She had cried until she had no tears left, and what remained was a quiet, fragile acceptance. She thought of the nocturne blooms, the flowers that were strongest in the dark. Maybe this was her purpose, to be a brief, secret bloom in a king's lonely darkness, and then to be cut down to ensure the sun could rise on his kingdom. It made a certain, tragic kind of sense. An Omega's life was a whisper. A king's was a roar that shaped the world. Who was she to stand in the way of that? When the guards came, she did not fight. She stood on numb legs, her shackled hands held before her. They led her up the winding stone stairs, out of the darkness and into the biting cold of the dawn. The entire court was there. They stood in a silent, grim circle around the wooden platform in the center of the courtyard. Their faces were a sea of hostile curiosity, their eyes like chips of stone. They were not here to mourn. They were here to watch a weed be plucked from the garden. And then she saw him. Aldrich stood on a raised dais flanked by Lord Valerius. He was dressed in black, his face a mask of such cold, remote authority that he looked like a statue carved from winter itself. He was every inch the ruthless king they all believed him to be. Her breath caught. There was no flicker of the man from the garden in his eyes, no trace of the wolf who had held her in the dark. Deep down, she knew the truth. He had made his choice. He had chosen his crown. And she could not blame him for it. As the guards forced her to her knees, her head pressed against the rough, splintered wood of the executioner's block, she did not think of the axe. She did not think of the injustice. She thought of the scent of pine in a moonlit garden. She thought of the impossible taste of a red apple. She thought of the rough, gentle sound of his voice saying her name. It was enough. It would have to be. The executioner, a hulking, hooded figure, moved into her line of sight. He raised the great gleaming axe high into the air. She closed her eyes.
He watched her walk. Each step she took was a hammer blow against the crumbling walls of his soul. He saw her ragged tunic, her shackled wrists, the quiet, heartbreaking dignity in her posture. She was not crying. She was not screaming. She was accepting her fate, and he was the one who had condemned her to it. His mask of cold indifference was perfect. No one saw the war raging inside him. No one saw the wolf clawing, screaming, tearing at him, begging to be let out. Ours. She is ours. Do not let them harm her. He looked at Valerius, who stood beside him, a smug, triumphant glint in his old, cunning eyes. He had won. He looked at the court, their faces hungry for a show of strength, for the blood of a traitor. And then he looked back at Lyra. She knelt, Her head bowed. The executioner raised his axe. In that single, silent, horrifying moment, everything shattered. He saw his father's blood on the stones. He saw a kingdom built on fear and coldness. He saw a throne that was nothing but a gilded cage. He saw a life of empty, lonely power stretching out before him into an eternity of gray. And he saw her, the girl who looked at him and saw not a monster, but a man. The Omega who had defied him, who had trusted him, who had kissed him with a desperate, beautiful fire. His father's weakness. It wasn't weakness. It was love. And his own strength. It wasn't strength. It was fear. A coward's fear of feeling anything at all. What was the point of a kingdom if it was empty? What was the point of a crown if it cost him his soul? In the span of a breath, the king died, and the mate was born. The axe began its descent. Stop! The word was not a request. It was a roar. It was the sound of an alpha king unleashing the full, unbridled power of his will upon the world. It cracked through the morning air like a bolt of lightning, a sonic boom of pure command that made the very stones of the courtyard tremble. The executioner froze mid-swing, his muscles locked. Every head whipped towards the dais. Every eye was on the king, and the king was no longer made of ice. He was made of fire. He moved. He did not stride down from the dais as a king. He descended as a storm, a force of nature that could not be denied. The world narrowed to a single path of cold stone between him and the girl on the executioner's block. The shocked faces of his court, the triumphant sneer of Valerius. They were nothing. Ghosts in a world that now contained only two beings, him and her. He reached the platform. The executioner, still frozen by the force of his command, stood like a stone statue, the axe held uselessly in his hands. Aldrich didn't even glance at him. Instead, he knelt. For the second time in his life, he knelt before her. He reached out, his hand surprisingly gentle, and broke the shackles on her wrists. The sound of the metal snapping was like the breaking of the final chain on his own soul. He pulled her to her feet, her body trembling against his. She was so small, and she was everything. He looked at the court, at the sea of pale, stunned faces, and he let them see. He let them see the truth he had hidden for a lifetime. He let them see the wolf. A wave of raw, golden power erupted from him, a visible shimmer in the cold morning air. It was the untamed, absolute power of a true alpha, a king not of laws and scrolls, but of blood and instinct. He lowered his head to her neck, ignoring her terrified gasp, and breathed in her scent. Moonlight, fear, and mine. Then he bit her. The act was both a claiming and a coronation. His fangs pierced her skin, a jolt of searing, possessive fire that bound their souls together for eternity. He felt the bond slam into place, a river of fire and light that flooded his senses. He felt her shock, her pain, and then a wave of overwhelming, radiant strength that met his own. He lifted his head, his lips stained with a single drop of her blood. Her eyes, wide and luminous, were no longer filled with fear. They were filled with him. As the bond pulsed between them, a living, breathing thing, he turned to face his kingdom. He held Lyra protectively behind him, a low, possessive growl rumbling in his chest. His voice, when it came, was not the voice of the king they knew. It was the voice of the wolf, and it was the voice of a mate. "She is not a traitor," he roared, the sound echoing off the ancient stones. "She is my mate, your queen."
The bite was pain, and then it was everything else. It was a supernova exploding behind her eyes. It was every star in the heavens igniting at once. It was a river of pure, molten life pouring into her, chasing away the cold, chasing away the fear, chasing away a lifetime of believing she was nothing. She felt him. Not just the man beside her, but his soul. His strength was her strength. His rage was her rage. His fierce, desperate, possessive love was a tidal wave that remade her world. The timid, sleeping wolf inside her didn't just stir. It rose up, a great, silver beast, and howled in triumph. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. She was no longer Lyra, the Omega. She was his. And then the chaos erupted. "He's mad!" Lord Valerius shrieked, his voice cracking with fury and disbelief. "The Omega has bewitched him. He is compromised. A king ruled by his base instincts cannot be a king at all. Guards, seize them both. Seize the witch and the fool she has made of him." A few of the elite warriors, Valerius's loyal dogs, drew their swords, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. The old Lyra would have hidden behind Aldrich. But as her wolf stirred, she stepped to his side. She was not his weakness. She was his queen. Her goal was no longer just to survive, it was to win. She met the gazes of the wavering guards, and for the first time, she did not see them as terrifying predators. She used her empathy, her curse that was now a gift, and she saw the truth. They were not loyal to Valerius. They were loyal to strength, and they were terrified of the raw power rolling off Aldrich in waves. Before either could speak, Aldrich held up a hand. "You accuse my mate of treason, Valerius," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "But the traitor is not on the executioner's block." He turned his gaze to the crowd, his golden eyes finding a single, terrified serving man cowering near the back. "Torvin, step forward." The man, his face the color of ash, stumbled forward and fell to his knees, trembling. "Tell them," Aldrich commanded, his voice leaving no room for lies. "Tell them who gave you the vial of poison. Tell them who paid you to hide it in my mate's bed."
He had not been idle in the hours before dawn. While the king had wrestled with his ghosts, the strategist had laid a trap. He knew Valerius would use a pawn, and every pawn has a weakness. Torvin's was his younger sister, who was suffering from a lung sickness. A quiet word with the royal healer, a promise of the finest care. It was all it took. Now it was time to watch the final piece fall. Torvin the servant looked up, his eyes filled with tears of terror. He looked at Valerius, then at the king, then at the ground. My sister," he stammered. "She is safe in the royal healer's care," Aldrich said, his voice softening just enough to be a promise. "And she will remain so, as long as you tell the truth." That was all it took. The man's fear of Valerius was nothing compared to the love for his family. He raised a trembling, pointing finger. "It was him!" Torvin cried out, the words tearing from his throat. "Lord Valerius, he gave me the poison. He said the king had grown weak and a strong hand was needed to guide the kingdom." A collective gasp went through the court. The accusation was laid bare. The political game was over. Valerius's face contorted, the mask of the elder statesman melting away to reveal the snarling, cornered wolf beneath. "Lies!" Valerius roared, his voice hoarse. "The ramblings of a terrified traitor." "Then you will not object to a trial by combat," Aldrich said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. The tension broke. A trial by combat. The oldest law, a fight to the death to let the goddess of the hunt decide the truth. Valerius was trapped. To refuse was to admit guilt and be branded a coward. To accept was to face a king who had just unleashed the full fury of his alpha nature. But pride was a powerful poison. Valerius drew himself up, his eyes burning with a hateful fire. "I accept," he snarled. Aldrich gave Lyra's hand a single, reassuring squeeze. He then stepped forward into the center of the circle, shedding his formal black tunic, leaving him in just his leather breeches. He faced his old advisor, his most trusted councilman, his most bitter enemy. His goal was simple: end this. As the sky darkened with an approaching storm, he watched Valerius circle him. He was no longer a king defending his crown. He was a wolf defending his mate, and he was about to remind them all why the world trembled when he growled. The fight began not with a roar, but with the hiss of steel and the first drops of a gathering storm. Valerius was a snake, old and cunning. He fought with the vicious, efficient movements of a veteran, his sword a blur of silver in the gray morning light. He was goading him, hissing insults between parries. "See how the mighty king fights now," the old wolf snarled, his blade clashing against Aldrich's with a shower of sparks. "Not with a cold mind, but with the hot blood of a rutting pup. She has made you weak." But Valerius was wrong. Truth be told, Aldrich had never been stronger. He was not fighting with clouded emotion. He was fighting with a terrible crystal clarity. Every move was fueled by a purpose so pure and absolute it felt like a fire in his veins. He felt Lyra through the bond, a steady, warm presence at the edge of his senses. She was his anchor in the storm. Without warning, Valerius lunged, a feint to the left and a quick slash to the right. The blade bit deep into Aldrich's forearm. Pain, hot and sharp, flared up his arm. A gasp went through the crowd. Lyra's terror lanced through the bond, a spike of ice in the fire. Valerius grinned, his teeth yellowed. "The first cut is the deepest, my king." But then, something incredible happened. As if her fear was a call to arms, Lyra's presence in his mind did not shrink. It surged. A wave of fierce, unwavering belief washed over him, a silent roar that was all her own. "Ours," the bond seemed to whisper. "Win." In the span of a breath, the pain in his arm vanished, replaced by a surge of raw, untamed power. He let out a roar, a true alpha's roar, a sound of thunder and fury that shook the very foundations of the keep. The wolf was no longer just a part of him. He was the wolf. He moved. He was a blur, a shadow of vengeance. He didn't just meet Valerius's attack, he overwhelmed it. His sword was a whirlwind of unstoppable force. The old wolf's cunning was no match for this primal, focused rage. Steel met steel, a parry, a lunge. The sound of a sword clattering against the stone floor echoed in the sudden, shocked silence. Aldrich stood over a disarmed, panting Lord Valerius, the tip of his blade pressed against the old wolf's throat. He had won. He looked at Valerius, at the man who had been his father's friend, at the snake who had tried to poison his world. The old Aldrich would have ended him without a second thought, a quick, clean execution to cauterize a wound. But he was not the old Aldrich. He looked at Lyra, her face pale but her eyes shining with fierce pride. Her empathy was not a weakness. It was a strength that tempered his own. "Death is too quick a punishment for a wolf who has no honor," Aldrich said, his voice ringing with a new kind of authority. "You will be banished, stripped of your name, your lands, your rank. You will live out your days as a lone wolf, with nothing but the memory of your treason for company, so that you may serve as a living reminder of what happens to those who threaten the heart of this pack." He pulled his sword away, and in the quiet that followed, a single alpha warrior dropped to one knee, then another, and another, until the entire court, warriors, nobles, servants, was kneeling in the damp courtyard. They were not kneeling to a king of fear. They were kneeling to a king who had fought for love.
The world returned in a rush of sound and color. The scent of rain on the air, the sight of 100 kneeling wolves, the feeling of Aldrich's victory, a triumphant, sun-warm pulse through their bond. He was walking towards her. He ignored the kneeling court, ignored the guards who were dragging a defeated, spitting Valerius away. His world had narrowed, and she was at the center of it. Her body moved on instinct, meeting him in the middle of the circle. He was bleeding, his arm stained a dark crimson. He was splattered with mud and sweat. He was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low, rough rumble meant only for her. His golden eyes scanned her from head to toe, searching for any injury. Her breath caught. He had just fought for his life, for his kingdom, and his first thought was for her. "No," she whispered, her hand coming up to gently touch the cut on his arm. "Are you?" He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. A small, wondrous smile, the first she had ever seen, touched his lips. "It is nothing." He took her hand, his large, calloused fingers lacing through her smaller ones. The fit was perfect. Without another word, he turned and began to lead her away from the courtyard. Not towards the dungeons, not towards the Omega dens, but up the main steps, towards the great doors of the keep. He was leading her home. The court remained kneeling as they passed, a silent testament to the new world that had just been born. She walked beside him, her head held high, their joined hands a symbol that everyone could see. She was no longer a shadow. She was the king's mate. She was the Omega Queen. And for the first time in her life, she was not afraid of the light. Weeks later, the world was a different place. The great council hall, a room that had once terrified her, now felt right. She sat not on a throne, but in a carved wooden chair beside Aldrich's, a respected and integral part of his rule. The alphas of the council still spoke of borders and treaties, but now they also spoke of other things. The grain stores for the outer villages are lower than expected for the coming winter, a grizzled old alpha was reporting, his brow furrowed with worry. Before Aldrich could issue a command, Lyra spoke, her voice quiet but clear in the silent hall. The Omegas have always been taught how to forage for winter root and preserve berries, she said, her gaze steady. They have reserves, hidden knowledge that has never been asked for. If we share the royal stores with the villages now, the Omegas can teach their skills to the others to replenish what is used. No one need go hungry. A stunned silence fell over the room. The alphas looked from her to the king, expecting him to dismiss her. Instead, Aldrich looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, open pride that made her heart swell. An excellent plan, my queen, he said, his voice warm. See that it is done. In that moment, she knew she had found her true power. It wasn't in a crown or a title. It was in her heart, her empathy, the quiet knowledge of the shadows that she could now bring into the light. That night, he led her to their garden. The Moonthorn Garden was no longer wild and forgotten. The thorns had been cleared and the roses were beginning to bloom. Under the light of a full silver moon, Aldrich led her to the patch of nocturne blooms. Look, he whispered, his voice a soft rumble against her ear as he wrapped his arms around her from behind. As if on cue, the small, tight white buds began to unfurl, their petals opening to greet the darkness. They were not cowards. They were beautiful. Her chest ached with a love so fierce, so profound, it felt as bright as the moon above. You were right, she murmured, leaning back against his strong, solid chest. Their strength was always there. They just needed the right kind of night to show it. He pressed a kiss to her temple, his lips warm against her skin. As did I, he confessed, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer hid. You are my night, Lyra. You are my moon and all my stars. She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his rugged face. She looked into his golden eyes, no longer haunted, no longer cold, but filled with a love that was as wild and true as the wolf within him. Their past was a story of shadows and fear, but their future was a kingdom of moonlight and hope, and it was just beginning.